Okay, this is part two of quotes from Rodney Stark. He's a historian. He wrote that Greek and Roman music was monophonic. The Romanesque cathedral was a post-Roman innovation. It was not Roman. But okay, what I was getting at here is these quotes are a little bit not perfectly organized. I read a bunch of books by him. The gist of it was that the Christians developed music. They're the ones that develop musical notation. They're the ones that develop polyphony, polyphonic music. So you could have multiple different instruments playing and have the notes written for them. The monophonic music of the Greeks and Romans was very simplistic compared to the development of the Christians. You know, they started out with Gregorian chants, but they then developed all the instrumental components of the music. And look at all these musical words. They come from Italy, all the stuff about the sonata and all the different terms. The Catholic Church funded a lot of creative work in music and stuff. And the great composers, the great artists, they would migrate to Rome, to produce their great work. But that's another wonderful thing about the Catholic Church. It celebrated the aesthetic side of life, which is a beautiful side of life. And I think part of that is because in a sense, it adopted paganism. It inherited paganism. It coexisted with paganism in Rome for over 500 years, from 30 AD to at least 530 AD and beyond. And I think they liked having that. The Christian stuff will mostly tell you, be good, don't break the rules, don't sin, love thy neighbor, all this stuff. And, I think in the Italian Renaissance, for example, if you look at the paintings, they got a kick out of the sort of wild, crazy party atmosphere, the Dionysian component of the ancient Greeks, but they also got the scholarly stuff from all the philosophers, the Plato, the Aristotle, the Socrates, the Thucydides, the Pericles, and all that stuff. Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. Okay, more quotes from Rodney Stark. He said, horses were not that useful in war until the invention of the stirrup, which is invented by the middle-aged Christians. Then they could charge with a lance, and this led to the knights on horseback. Chained mail was another big innovation, so you could block arrows more effectively from a distance. The crossbow was a big step, making the arrows more powerful, more convenient, like for a man on horseback. Alaric the Goth had previously been a Roman commander who was passed over for promotion, and then he left the Roman army, came back and sacked Rome. The Greeks innovated because individual cities were independent. So that was good. They had competition. And what he's getting at here is Rome kind of sucked. In Rome, they had so much slave labor, there was no motivation for innovation. That's why there was no big industrial revolution in Rome, because with all this free slave labor, you don't need the mill wheel, the water wheel, and all that stuff. Rodney Stark points out that the term Dark Ages is bogus. It's a myth. It was invented by these so-called Enlightenment scholars. They called their own age, let's say 1700s, the Enlightenment. And then they said the Middle Age was backward and against science. But the reality was, it was these Christians in the Middle Ages that were developing agriculture, the stirrup for the horses, horseshoes for the horses, the knights, mail and metallurgy, better clocks, better calendars, better astronomy. Copernicus was a Catholic priest or deacon, okay? All of that stuff. Galileo was very Christian, okay? And they try to act like Galileo is some real bad science story. Galileo was briefly on house arrest because he insulted the Pope. And, that was an overreaction. But 35 craters on the moon, they're named after Jesuit priests, okay? That's where astronomy comes from. What we would call modern astronomy, the advanced stuff. And the joke of it was the guys who called the Middle Ages the Dark Ages were people like Voltaire, who didn't do any science, or Edward Gibbon, who didn't do any science, or Rousseau, who was a total crazy blowhard, and Diderot, another jerk. Those are the guys who destroyed France with the Big Rev, 1789 to 1794. Disaster, okay? Whenever you go down the path of atheism, you end up with a bunch of stuff like they had in France with the guillotine, okay? Destruction. It destroys a country. Okay, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the sacking of Rome, 476 AD, the population of Rome dropped from 500,000 to about 50,000. They no longer had the food coming in. They no longer had the taxation wealth coming in. Only about 5% of people were literate in ancient Rome, but at least the aristocrats had some leisure. You need people with some leisure time that they could read, people with some leisure time that they could write. You also need leisure time if you're going to do painting and sculpture. I look at the history of Europe, for example, and I notice, my father's from Ireland, my mother's from Puerto Rico, but my father from Ireland, the Irish people really didn't produce hardly anything in painting, and they produced hardly anything in science and technology, and that's because they didn't have any money. When you're broke, a poor person could be a musician. They were good at making music and at singing. Poor person could be a good writer. Poor man can sit around and write about how pissed off he is on the weekends, but you need money to do scientific experiments. You need money and canvases and paints and equipment to be a painter. So poor countries or countries that were enslaved like Ireland, they don't do that much in those areas. But they were good at writing and at music. They're great at those things. Okay, Rodney Stark continues, you couldn't do anything in China because the Mandarins would take all your stuff away or destroy it. He talked about how the mindset of other countries, like India, the Hindu Maya concept of the universe is unknowable. Well, then you're not motivated to study science, okay? And then he said modernity arose in the West and only in the West because it had the Christian worldview that man is created in the image of God, therefore he too can be a creator. Our God made a rational universe, as it says in the Bible, therefore it can be understood. We do honor to the Creator when we study His creation. So we were motivated to study it, and we did, and we learned a lot. There's smart people everywhere, but they didn't have the motivation to do it. And all this stuff about slavery. Slavery's been in every culture since the beginning of recorded history. It's Christianity that got rid of it. All known ancient large cultures had slavery. The American Indians had slavery before Columbus came to America. Slavery still exists in most parts of the world, still exists in Africa, still exists in the Muslim world. Okay, in Athens, they had about the same number of slaves as free people, but the free people were uniquely more free than they were anywhere else. In most places, it was just a brutal tyrant dictator who didn't let anybody do anything. He says, do what I say or I'll kick your butt. That's pretty much how 99% of human societies have been since recorded history began. In Muslim cultures, according to Rodney Stark, he says Muhammad owned slaves, he bought and sold slaves, he married a slave, and he did say the slaves should be treated kindly, but he clearly approved of owning them. He did free some of his slaves, and again, he said that they should be given the same kind of clothes as their owner, so he was nice to them, but still, they're still slaves. For many hundreds of years, Christians were taken captive and then were sold into slavery in the Muslim world. That's a well-known fact. Christianity goes with capitalism. It was the Catholic Church who developed capitalism for its wide-ranging estates to motivate people. The Middle Ages had a warming phase that's not talked about. Deuteronomy kind of spoke against lending, and that's what led to bans on usury. Okay. One thing here, he briefly talks about South America and the Aztecs. And the other tribes of the area, they hated the Aztecs because the Aztecs every year would sacrifice thousands of people in front of big crowds. And then they would take the sacrificed bodies and feed them to the crowd. That's cannibalism, okay? That's pretty backward. Okay, so there's mankind without Christianity. It ain't a pretty sight, okay? And they were backward. That's why, a couple hundred Cortez, Pizarro, could conquer thousands and thousands of Middle Americans in Mexico area and whatnot, the Aztec and the Mayan areas, because they were backward, okay? European technology was far superior. Why was it superior? Because they had Christianity, which motivated them to develop it. It's just a fact. Everybody knows that. Thomas Aquinas, the popes, they all spoke out strongly against slavery. So anyways, that's all I got for Rodney Stark for today. I hope you found that helpful.